Good morning, everyone. How are you all doing? I hope you're doing well, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us here today. I'm Lloyd Goodwin. I'm Associate Director of Policy here at CLES, and I'd like to offer you all a very warm welcome to this event, to this webinar, which is essentially a conversation between our outgoing Chief Executive, Neil McInroy, and CLES's new CEO, Sarah Longlands. And we're going to be exploring the moment that we're in for local economic development and looking at what this means for community wealth building. So I thought this was going to be something akin to a bit of a fireside chat, although judging from some of the Zoom backdrops I'm looking at there, I'm not sure that memo quite got through, but never mind. Now, in a moment, I'm going to be handing over to Rachel Shabi from The Independent, who's going to be chairing today's session. But let me just start with a quick bit of housekeeping and a little bit of context setting. So from a housekeeping point of view, it's all very straightforward, really. I'm sure you all know Zoom. So we want you to feel as involved as you can be on a Zoom webinar. So please do use the chat function box at the bottom of your screens to introduce yourselves and to the rest of the audience, as well as us. Just a note that we'll be recording today's session, and we'll send you a link to that recording as soon as it's available. Finally, if you do have any questions for Sarah or for Neil, please do use the Q&A box to pose these questions. You'll be able to upvote and comment on each other's questions too, so please do use this facility to keep the debate lively. Just a little bit of context before we get into it then. Very briefly, in case you're new to CLES, you don't know who we are. So we're the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. We're the national organisation for local economies, and we have a firm commitment really to realising progressive economics for people, for place and for planet, and to help people who are experiencing social and economic inequality and lack of opportunity. Our fundamental aim then is to achieve social justice, good local economies and effective public services for everyone, everywhere. So we've been doing a lot of thinking, I think it's fair to say, and reflection recently on the past, the present and the future of community wealth building. You might have seen a couple of weeks ago, we released a podcast on the history of community wealth building through the thinking and doing lens of CLES over the last 10 to 15 years. And this effectively brought us up to date to the moment that we're now in really for community wealth building, which is of course a moment where we're grappling with the mortal threat of climate emergency, as well as the ongoing challenges of COVID-19. In this, there are of course huge challenges for local economic development and for the formulation of progressive local economic strategies, and that's what we want to unpack and explore today. So a recording of this event is going to feature in our upcoming second podcast, which should be released in a week or so's time, so do look out for that. And finally, just to say the discussion that we're having today is really a reflection of the massive growth and interest we're seeing in community wealth building. And to that end, we're proud to announce that we've expanded and refreshed our Community Wealth Building Centre of Excellence. And this Centre of Excellence is of course a hub for resources, for policy and practice guides, for events, for training, as well as our communities of practice in housing, health, and of course local government. If you go onto our website, there's new case studies available there. There's also a new publication we've released today, which is a transcript of our first podcast. So do go onto our website, take a look, have a look around. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rachel Shabi, who's going to chair today's session. Rachel, over to you.
Thank you so much, Tom. And good morning, everyone. It's so amazing to see so many of you join us from all over the place this morning. I'm always these days massively impressed with, high attendance to Zoom anyway, because I think we're all a bit fatigued of the format. But at the same time, I completely understand it when it's to do with this subject, and also to hear from this sort of power duo of Sarah Longlands and Neil McInroy. So I also feel the same, and therefore I understand why we've all chosen to be indoors this morning rather than, working from park on this sunny day. And those of us, if you're listening in to the podcast, you will have missed the heavy ironic quotation marks around working in the park this morning. But I think the reason that this subject is so important and compelling at the moment is you know, while there are sort of varying degrees of, you know, despair and inertia and frustration at the situation we're in, both emerging from the pandemic and multiple disasters unfolding before us, including the climate emergency, and not to sugarcoat the pain and the heartbreak and the loss and the devastation that so many have been through over the last 16 months, and also not to let the government off the hook for its chaotic, confusing, and sometimes downright negligent handling of this pandemic. I think what is so striking to me in talking with people over the last 16 months is the huge amount of local effort, local authorities, local community work, and so on, that actually was scaffolding, held the nation up over the last 16 months. And I think we possibly will never know the extent, you know, how much worse it might have been without all that amazing work at local level. But also at the same time, this incredible amount of community engagement and people just wanting to step up and step in and help and be a part of local efforts to help. And in a way, doing what the writer Rebecca Solnit describes essentially as citizenship that we're not ordinarily asked to think about or engage in, i.e. the citizenship of just being a part of public life and connected to each other in our communities. So these things converging make this conversation of what actually is possible on a local level in terms of community wealth building, in terms of democratic economic wealth building, of local participation, of, you know, guerrilla localism, all these things that such endeavors have been called. It makes it such a pressing and urgent question. And I can think of no better people to discuss that and engage with that conversation than the two panelists we're about to hear from today, both the outgoing and the incoming chief executives of CLES. First of all, incoming, a very big hello and welcome to Sarah Longlands, who before joining CLES was chief executive, was director of IPPR North, which is the dedicated think tank for the north of England. She previously did work for CLES until 2011, and then began her career in local government working in County Durham and in North Yorkshire. Sarah has a PhD in urban studies from the University of Glasgow and is an expert in regional and local economic development, and argues for economic and social justice and the creation of places which enable people to live good lives. And then we have the outgoing chief exec, Neil McInroy, who has been for 20 years overseeing the running of CLES and the development of the organization. Neil has, this has involved collaborating with other bodies. He's a leading commentator on economic development and public policy. He's featured in the Local Government Chronicles annual top 50 most influential people in local government. And while leaving CLES, Neil is very much remaining a part of this movement, as he will join the Democracy Collaborative as a senior global advisor and community wealth building fellow, so working on advancing this approach in the US. So two fantastic speakers. What we're going to do this morning is hear 5 minutes from each, looking at various aspects of community wealth building in relation to the moment we're in. Sarah is going to be looking at the sort of key challenges facing local economic development at the moment. Neil is going to be looking at community wealth building and how it's in a position to meet some of those challenges and what might be done to scale up the impact. So and then we're going to open up to a Q&A, first from me and then from all of you. We're very keen to hear your questions to these two brilliant speakers. And so without further ado, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce the first speaker for today's event, which is Sarah Longlands. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks very much, Rachel, and to Tom, and to all of you for joining us here this morning. It's a real pleasure to be able to be with Neil today and to tell you about some of our thoughts on where we are at the moment and where we hope that we can go next, if you like, both in terms of the economy and in terms of the work that we do at CLES. And I guess I just wanted to start off by giving some kind of reflections, just 3 brief reflections really on where we are at the moment and what the pandemic and what the crises that we face are telling us about the type of place we live in at the minute, the type of economy that we have, and perhaps also where we need to go in the future. And I think for me, one of the really striking things about the pandemic has been, firstly, that it has been revelatory. It has revealed what many of us all knew already. The foundations of our economic model are cracked and creaking, and that it is failing to deliver a good life for too few people. And, you know, it is not that the pandemic has created inequality, but it has revealed just how unequal we were to begin with, and has set us on course to widen the gap even farther. No matter what metric you look at, health, income, job quality, all of those metrics are heading in the wrong direction. And one of, I think, the reasons for that, one of the reasons why we have this kind of runaway inequality, if you like, is that the orthodoxy of economics to date has not considered the ethics of its decision making, the ethics of care and how people should be treated as part of the economic process. Instead, orthodox economics suggests that should be the remit of politicians. And I think that is something at CLES that we would argue isn't right, and that we would argue that the ethics of care particularly, should be part and parcel of how we do economics, and not just in terms of how we temper its consequences. So I think that for me is the first thing, that revealing, that pulling away the curtain and exposing the ugly truth of our economic model to date. And the second thing about the pandemic, I think, in the moment that we're in at the moment, with those kind of confluence of crises coming together, is that our experiences of these crises is different depending on where we live, and place really does matter in this. And we've seen that during the pandemic. You know, I live in Bolton, and that has been really at the epicenter of the national debate on the crises, and has shown really how where you live, the type of neighborhood you grow up in, the services that you have on your doorstep, all of those different neighborhood effects have a direct impact on your ability to live a good life. And that is a direct consequence of the economic model. And it is the same for the economy, if you like, that not only do we live in an institutional context where we are highly centralized, but the power is very much directed from Westminster, but we also have a situation where economic power is also highly centralized, not just in Westminster, but in the hands of corporates who often have very little or no accountability to the places in which they decide to land. And indeed, you know, there's a song which says that England for some is only a place to park their car. And I think that is something that many of us feel instinctively about the way in which our economies are bought and sold easily, too easily, if you like, and that individual futures end up being dependent on those decisions. So faced with those challenges, the local and local power becomes particularly important. And it's also, I think, the most exciting opportunity to start to change things, because we, as Rachel mentioned, you know, we are citizens of place, whether we are living in a community, whether we're working in a community, whether we're setting up a business in a local area, whether we're part of local government. We can work together at the local level, and we can change things for the better, because we cannot afford to wait for Westminster to change it for us. We have to take the fight to them, if you like. And that is why CLES exists. And we believe that a better way is possible, and a better local economic development approach is also doable and feasible and can happen within our lifetimes. Which brings me to my third and final point about reclaiming economics and economic development. Because economics in itself is not the enemy, but instead the sort of very narrow technocratic understanding of economics, which has dominated the political conversation in this country for far too long. Because the way in which economics works at the minute pits place against place, community against community. It conceptualizes human beings as greedy, thirsty and self-interested. Now, certainly that is one of our characteristics, but it is not all that we are, and we should not allow economics in its traditional sense to define us as such. Instead, economics, often seen as the villain of the piece, can also be part of the solution. We can stop assuming that the good that we are seeking is growth, and instead focus on how we use economic prosperity more wisely, how we can share the benefits, how we can rewire the economic system from the start in terms of ownership, in terms of democracy, and making sure that we are giving people a chance to live a better life. We can stop measuring the progress of our economy through narrow measures such as GDP, a really poor proxy for human welfare, and instead focus on actually creating a good life, allowing and enabling people to be and to do and to live a life that they have a reason to value. And thirdly, we can stop saying there is no money, there is no wealth, that there is a finite amount of support that can be given to people. There is plenty of wealth in a country like ours. You know, in the UK, 5 of the richest families own more than the poorest 13 million people. And by continually repeating this mantra, creating this deficit mindset, not only in terms of the money that we have as a country and the wealth that we hold, but that the places themselves of something are to blame for the problems that they face, that they are somehow at fault. By continuing to repeat those messages, we create inertia, and we disable the opportunities for people to actually get involved and actually have a say and to actually take much greater ownership of their destiny. And that is why CLES exists, because we believe that local economies are the future, and they are the place where change can happen. And we want to work with people, to support people, to make that happen, whether they're in local government, in local communities, or in local business. I guess the biggest challenge that we face is that we cannot haul the ship into a dry dock for repairs. Instead, we must fix the ship while it is still at sea. And that is, I guess, the biggest challenge for all of us as we face these crises now. But at the local, that is a scale and an opportunity that we can come to terms with, and we can start to re-engineer, to rewire, and to reorientate our direction so that we can find a better path and a better direction of travel for our economies and for people's lives. So that's the 3 kind of points for me: the opportunity to reveal the extent of the problem, the chance to share a different type of economy in the future, and thirdly, to reclaim, if you like, ownership of the economy, and particularly of the local economy, so that we can use that to drive forward a better future. So thanks very much, and really looking forward to the conversation with Neil after this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah. That was an incredibly strong and thought-provoking introduction to this session. That was Sarah Longlands, who is the incoming Chief Executive of CLES. I was particularly struck by what you said about the sort of inertia and disconnection that our political system and political reality has created, and what we might do to, you know, drive through that, overwhelm that, and produce something quite different, and something that produces engagement as well. So as I say, lots to think about in that opening. Thank you so much. Please do send your questions through in the Q&A, everyone. We're very keen to hear from you all. But for now, what I'd like to do is hear a little bit from Neil McInroy. So this is the outgoing Chief Executive of CLES, who has been overseeing the running of CLES and the development of the organization for the past 20 years. So a very warm welcome and a handover to you, Neil.
Delighted to, sorry, I'm on mute. Great start. Delighted to be with you all. Thank you, Rachel, and thanks, Sarah, my fellow traveller and long-term colleague in this progressive local economic development movement. I'm just going to reflect a little bit on the moment we're in, and then touch upon, progressive local economics with a focus on community wealth building. But I kind of see these times very similar to Sarah. This is oxymoronic times. There is much crisis, but great hope. And I think in our work at CLES, and all of you out there listening in or watching in, whatever place we work, we hear and see despair, pain, and misery. And they are symptoms of climate, ecological, democratic, and economic crisis. And let's, as Sarah was, let's just hammer that home. Our economic model fails to work for us and the planet. It's indubitable. It's an economy that extracts precious resource and wealth, producing untold riches for many, whilst at the same time produces inequality, poverty, and misery for multitudes. But also, at the same time of that great crisis, this is the oxymoronic time we're in, but there's also great hope. There is a new sense that we can and also must make that step change and reshape our economy and society. The sense is growing, folks, and organizations like CLES and many of you and other organizations at the forefront of catalyzing and building on that hope with practical acceleration and action. And that's where community wealth building fits in. This is an unprecedented time in human history. And there's a tendency here, I think, for some to think this is a plow on in a linear way, a hope that we're on a track and we've got a better destination just down that straight line track. Nirvana's there. Yeah, paradise is just follow on, make some decision, we'll get there. Steadily onward to a better world. We need to disabuse ourselves of that, folks. We're not on a linear onward track. The track we're in is a roller coaster loop, a closed loop, a doom loop even, and we need to break out of that loop. We need to make a quantum leap, a paradigm shift into a completely new path, a new track. Now, back at the start of the pandemic, CLES wrote with our good friends, the Democracy Collaborative, who I'm joining, a piece called Owning the Future. And this work, we talked about three pathways: the good, the bad, and the ugly. The ugly was an idea of full-on shock doctrine disaster response with a new state authoritarianism, with ongoing uncontrolled corporate capitalism, with support for plutocracy and growing political cronyism. We wrote this back in the beginning of April, with threats to our civil liberties and disrespect to democratic structures and institutions. An ugly path. Then there was the bad, a rush back to the old normal. Let's get back to our offices. Let's get the old patterns of wealth and power and inequality back. It would be a rerun of the kind of response we had post-GFC, with public service austerity seen as the price to pay. And then the good. In this scenario, there's an understanding that the present crisis is our last and best opportunity to change course, to build a more local, generative, social, and democratic economic system. The COVID pandemic and the crises I've talked about become a moment of crystallization, with citizens, governments working together to build new social contract and a genuine, inclusive, well-being economy. We, all of us, must do everything we can to bring about good and to avoid a reflexive lapse to the linear path to the bad, or even worse, descending in to the ugly. And with the good, folks, we can be super, super hopeful. The good is all around us, and community wealth building is part of that. It's a new sense of community, as Rachel talked about, a sense of community, a togetherness, and how we don't just stand as individual human beings, but collective human social beings. And in this, I'm struck by the work of Roberto Onger, the Brazilian philosopher and advocate of radical social innovation, who part inspired some of the theoretical basis to community wealth building. Roberto says we're in the moment of experiments, where a multitude of initiatives have the potential, collectively, to foreshadow bigger change. This is a horizontal power, folks, with a persuasive will to change vertical power. And we can see it all around us across the 5 pillars of community wealth building. Thousands of virtuous actions taking place all over. We've seen it in progressive administrations across the world and in the UK. We're seeing it in the rise of movements like Black Lives Matter and civic activism. We're seeing it in land reform and community ownership. We're seeing it in flourishing of cooperatives and community businesses. We're seeing it in reaction against big corporate power and guerrilla localism and new independent economic activity. We're seeing it in public pension funds divesting from fossil fuels. We're seeing it in new forms of fair work and respect for unionisation. We're seeing a multitude of green activity taking place in every single street and community across the land. We're seeing it in a belief of democratically owned and run public services, a multitude of action and activism, all telling us that the economy, as Sarah said, it's not some abstract thing controlled by others that we fit into. No. It's one that we can shape. It's our economy. It's our economy. We need to bring it back to us so we can shape it the way we want and the way that nurtures and preserves the planet. In this, there are organisations like CLES and a myriad of other organisations turning the dial and supporting this. Community wealth building, working every day across administrations across the UK and elsewhere across the world, trying to harvest that energy, place it into strategies, force changes within mainstream economic development, turning the dial every single day, making the difference, horizontal power affecting real change. All community wealth building is showing, reflecting, scaling the better way. That is the way that we need to advance the moment we're in. Thanks for listening so far. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neil, for that brilliant, powerful analysis of both the pain, despair, and suffering of the moment we're in, but also the possibility and dynamism and engagement and hive of activity that is already taking place to change that and to address that. That was Neil McInroy, who until this very day and for the past 20 years has overseen the running of CLES. Right, I can see some brilliant questions coming in from all of you. Please do keep those coming. We're very keen to hear from you all. I do just have a couple of questions for both Sarah and Neil of my own before we open up to a discussion. And I wanted to ask both of you, first of all, we have, as you say, been witnessing this increase in local activity, local engagement, people wanting to be a part of the community, not just in terms of joining up to volunteer in various ways, but also seeing the businesses around them and the endeavors around them and wanting to support and sustain those endeavors as well. And I just wondered from you both, whether we can make use of that sort of increased activity and interest in communities and local economies that has emerged from this pandemic. And I'd like to ask Sarah, first of all. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, and a great question. And I think one of the consequences of the pandemic is that suddenly the local has become so much more important, and where we live and how we live. And the kind of importance of local services and community. And I think there is something about how pandemic has in some ways revitalized people's ideas of collectivism, if you like, or a sense that, you know, there are kind of goals that go beyond us as individuals that we can work towards together. But I think at times that has been overstated by politicians and perhaps used in a way that that simplifies the way in which we live and underestimates the real pain that many people have felt who don't feel part of the country, who feel completely and utterly alienated by the economy and the system of governance and everything else. And so I think whilst there is there's a sense that in some sense communities that people are closer together, and I think that's right. We shouldn't pretend that is that this is somehow going to be a kind of blitz spirit that will see us through in the longer term. And I think there are deeper questions about how communities come together in this crisis, not just because you live next door to them, but come together from all walks of life, and particularly because we know the way in which the crisis has disproportionately affected people on lower incomes, on ethnic minority communities, and many other, and people with disabilities. So how do we actually start to not only encourage people to come together because they happen to know each other, they live in the same street or whatever, but come together across some of those social and political divides, and start to actually break open and deal with some of those divides in our society, so that it's not just middle classes getting together because it's a lovely day, but we're seeing communities come together across all of those structural divides that are in our society. And I think one of the really important things is that we start to rediscover, as Neil said, we own the economy and we also own the state. And I think, rediscovering the power of our local state in our communities, and the fact that local councils have been right on the receiving end of the worst impacts of not only austerity for the last 10 years, but also of the need to respond to the pandemic. And I think starting to realise and revalue our local state is going to be a really important part of how we come out of this, and starting to really recognise that the state is not something against us or something that we should be trying to oppose all the time locally, but actually we own it, we pay for it, and we should be also supporting it to try and grow and develop and get itself out of this real huge challenge that we face now in terms of local services and funding, but also the approaching crises of environmental and climate change.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah. I think it's really important to highlight, as you just did so eloquently, the layered challenges of the sort of structural problems and inequalities that are so deep and entrenched that we're dealing with at the moment. Thank you. Can I open up that same question to Neil? Thank you.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with what Sarah's saying. And I think, like the oxymoronic point I make, there's great possibilities and great perils here. Communities come together. It's a truism, really. That's what communities do. We're social beings. And I think there is one of the perils is that there's some out there who see this as a chance to revive the big society, Cameron's big society baloney, which in a sense is saying, let's attack the state by using community power. Community will deliver public service on the cheap, and sometimes in terms of volunteer, unremunerated. And that's a way how we can, post-pandemic, to reshape the social contract. We'll just get the community to do more. That is a real peril, and we must avoid that like the plague. Some people talk of community power, but what they mean is a big society revivalism and an attack on the state, and people doing things for themselves rather than the state, which is in a sense the bureaucratic manifestation of community, to doing it themselves. What we need to think about community is to actually start to take on the private sector economy. Yeah, I'm much more interested in that. How do we get community taken from owning more land and property? How do we get into retail, manufacturing, things in the everyday economy, the foundational economy? That's the real prize for community power. To use that energy, not to do public service in the cheap, that's a public service job. It's actually to take on the problems we have within extractive fossil capitalism and start to take on the actual basis to how our commercial economy doesn't serve us. And so we are in an oxymoronic time. There's possibilities and pitfalls, and we need to watch who's advocating for this community power. Yeah, what is behind what they're actually trying to pursue. And if you get community power on the back of retained public service austerity, you'll end up with a big society. We'll end up having a much weakened state, and you'll end up having less social solidarity in our economy and our society.
Thank you so much for that, Neil. I think that's such an important caveat and qualifier to all this community work, that it should be a driver for political and structural change rather than a replacement of it. Really important to keep that front and center of this conversation. Right, I just had one more question before we open up, and that is looking at, and it taps in a little bit to the sort of dislocation and disengagement that both of you have spoken to. And I wonder what you think about what the limits are of this sort of community wealth building and localized work. Is it the sort of thing where, you know, people might react in terms of, well, that's great, but it will only go so far. It can't actually rewire the entire economy in the way that's so desperately needed. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, the limitations, I suppose, or the possibilities of this dynamic. Sarah.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Yeah, I mean, it's again, you know, it's another great question. I think, I guess, part of me thinks, you know, we are still in the foothills of community wealth building, and we haven't really even got to understanding what its full potential might be. So I guess part of me thinks, well, we don't really know the limits of community wealth building yet, because it hasn't actually reached its full potential yet. And I think that's quite an exciting place to be in for CLES and for other organisations like the Democracy Collaborative, you know, that are working so hard to see what we can do with this new idea and how we can really use it to rewire and re-democratise and re-energise communities across the UK and indeed globally. So I think that's something for us to reflect on. I think, you know, not necessarily a limit, but an opportunity or a possibility perhaps of it is to think about how we can link up with other movements and other progressive ideas about how we change our economy, but also how we change our approach to health, and to particularly to dealing with poverty as well, and how we can start to encourage other people to work with us, if you like, to try and solve these challenges together, and using community wealth building as a lens, but also working with other people to see what kind of lens they are looking at these challenges through, and how we can kind of take what we are learning from community wealth building and work with other people who are also trying to deal with these challenges, but from a different perspective, and see how they can, and see how we can make even something even more beautiful. You know, for example, just some of the work that CLES have been doing with NHS trusts. You know, NHS is often thought of as a big bureaucratic beast that's you know, highly centralized and so on. But some of the work we're doing with the NHS shows that they're trying to deal with, you know, huge pressures in terms of costs, huge issues in terms of recruitment, and what they're doing is taking inspiration from the community wealth building model and using it to direct their workforce strategy. So seeing themselves as an anchor organization and using the idea that their money shouldn't just be about delivering a service, but delivering a better opportunity and a better life, if you like, for their workforce. So I think that's a really tangible example of how community wealth building, you know, we're still in the early days of it, but actually it's not just about one model, it's more about an inspiration and saying, how can we do more with the wealth and the money that we already have, particularly in the public sector or in the state, if you like, that we all own, that our money, if you like. How can we do more with that to actually deal with some of the wider challenges that we face? And in doing so, you know, if the organisations of the NHS use their workforce strategy not only to deliver good services, but to deliver, you know, decent wages, good paying conditions, that has real multiplier effects, not just in the economy, but in terms of people's lives. So I think that's a real avenue for us to explore and expand. And I think the final thing I'd say on that is that there's also a question for me about how we start to work with the private sector on this, and start to encourage them also to think of themselves not just as a, you know, a fly-by-night move in here and move out there or whatever, but actually to think themselves. And I think a lot of businesses, particularly SMEs, already think of themselves like this, you know, but as part and parcel of the community, and that how they employ people, how they treat people, has a direct knock-on effect on everybody else's sense of well-being, and all of our ability to live a good life. So I think there is something interesting in that for us to explore.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Very much here for stories of things that actually have been done and worked and have driven change, and what those actual achievements point to in terms of future possibilities. Neil, can I ask you the same question?
Yeah, I would completely agree with Sarah and all that, and also the point about the theory of change. The moment we're in, we are in the foothills. So I think we're merging out of the foothills, and it's like that point about that horizontal power is starting to affect the actual vertical. And I think community wealth building in some parts of the world is starting to dig into the mainstream. For instance, yesterday or the day before, I was speaking to colleagues in Chicago in the US, and what you've got there is the Office for Equity and Racial Justice, who have got a community wealth building plan, which is starting to make changes within the wider economic policies and strategies and action of Chicago, a city of 3 million people. So this is entering the mainstream. It's entering the mainstream economic thought. And then also in Scotland, you have a government there in Scotland committed to doing community wealth building under the auspice of a wellbeing economy, and now have a minister for community wealth indeed. So it's starting to dig into the actual vertical power and actually digging into the mainstream. And not quite every day, but often now, I think probably every day at CLES, somebody speaks to somebody, corporates, other areas that are starting to say, hold on, what does this community wealth building mean for me? How can I get into this? So it starts with community. It starts with those bonds that connects us as human social beings. But of course, it's about scaling and amplifying and accelerating that up to affect big mainstream change. And that's how the CLES Centre of Excellence is so important, the work that Tom's doing, because that is a means by which we harvest stuff, show stuff, be persuasive, show and tell. And then people think, there's something in that. And so this is not community development. This is not, let's put community in a box and over there and the mainstream economy juggernauts on. This is actually hanging on to the juggernaut economy. It's hanging on to that extractive fossil capitalism, slowing it down and then changing it in a different track completely. But we are in the foothills. I'm getting enthusiastic and over talking it. We've got a lot of work to do and a lot of struggles to do politically, in practical terms, and in organising ourselves and making those, communing with other organisations and other like-minded people, as Sarah was saying. But I can see hope in that. That's what drives me anyway, for sure.
Thanks so much for that, Neil. Right, okay, I'd like to open up to some questions from the wider group, and I can see there's some absolutely brilliant questions here. We're not going to be able to go through them all, but I just want to thank everyone for posting them, just because they've generated a lot of, these questions are thoughtful and have generated some thinking and some discussion anyway. And so I really do appreciate all of those questions coming in. I'd like to take one now from Gareth, who's asking, how do areas that are economically more affluent make an ethical case for investment for those that aren't benefiting, when there are whole communities that are clearly in greater need? So I guess this is, the question is, what I'm thinking from that question is, will this produce even greater inequalities between areas that are, just about able to maybe pull themselves up, and areas that actually have sunk so far below where the need is so much greater? Sarah?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's a question further down about rural areas as well. I think there's kind of parallels with that as well. And I guess I would start by saying, one of the challenges with the way in which the sort of system of government in the UK works is the fact that places are, having to make the case all the time, go cap in hand to Westminster to say, oh, please, give us some money, blah, blah, blah. And, and then wait for a civil servant in a room in London to make the decision. And I think that to me is wrong, if you like. I think we shouldn't be having to do this bargaining deal making. We should simply be recognizing that as a society, we should be taking care of people who and supporting people who've not had the chance or the opportunity to live and to be And I think that's just something about the ethics of how our system works, that we don't have that ethic of care at the center of our democracy or our economy, and that it's about who can make the best argument, who can make the best case. And I just think that that's wrong. And I think that comes back to what I was saying about the way in which the system and which the economic system pits places against place. And I think there's also something important to say, you know, if you're working and living in a what might be classed as a more affluent area, and sometimes rural areas are you know, oh well, you know, you live in a rural area, what's wrong with you? Everything's fine, isn't it? And it's like, look, if you're poor in a rural area, you're going to be, it's going to be far, far worse in some aspects than if you're poor in the centre of Manchester. I mean, that's not to belittle that, but it's to sort of make the point that sometimes in those communities, if there are going to be far fewer resources, there's going to be far fewer options. Just take something like transport, for example. And when I used to work in the Durham Dales a long time ago, one of the things that really stayed with me was that if people were ill, if they had long-term needed long-term palliative care, they would simply just die quietly in the Dales because it was just too far to travel for treatment. And I think that's really wrong in a society like ours. So I think it isn't about making the case, it's about simply having an economic system which enables people to live a better life. And I think the case, I guess, if you have to make a case, it's about pointing out that why should people suffer anywhere in the UK, and if they are, then we should be doing something about it. But it's also, I think, about thinking about what you can do within your own area, and I think community wealth building tells us that there is stuff that you can do, even though that local authorities have been under the cosh for many years as a result of austerity. There are things that we can do. We can rewire some of the aspects of our local economy. We can look at ownership models to try and better direct income and resources to those who need it most, and particularly if we're in an area that perhaps is more affluent than others. So I think we're starting to engage with that and think about what can we do ourselves to re-engineer, to rewire, and to redirect resources to those who need it most. And I guess that's something that we do a lot all the time, in fact, through our work on community wealth building.
Thanks so much for that, Sarah. Neil?
Just picking up that rewiring point and to hammer it home, really, Sarah's spot on, is that this bit about different areas, what we need to think is fundamental rewiring. And community, what we need, of course, is a new redistributive process. Yeah, and that needs, and that's how we argue, and I will continue to argue, we need deep constitutional change in a new national social contract that does that redistributive stuff. But that won't be enough on its own, because we've tried that in the past. We also need, what Sarah touched upon, pre-distribution. This is about who owns the economy, not thinking about redistributing wealth after redistributing growth after the fact of its creation. How do we all get our dibs on it during creation? Not just people who earn wages, yeah, and that's important, we get decent wages, but also that we own more of the land, the property, the economic activity. That is fundamental to the type of new good economy we need to forge, rather than the bad or the ugly one. Ownership is kind of key. And just reflecting a little bit on that and some of the chat about how do we do this, how do we that, we need to respect that the UK and the world is very diverse, and we shouldn't just look through the English lens, which at the moment in policy terms, I would argue, is extraordinarily unfertile. It's fairly barren for some of these things. But that's not the case across all of England or across all of the UK, in fact. And whilst as a Scot who lives in England and loves England, whilst I see that policy infertility, broadly speaking, though there is great pockets around the country, there is huge fertility in terms of the social energy, the social diversity. We are one of the most diverse countries in the world. And how we broadly rub along all right. There's amazing energy in this country. It's just at this moment very unfortunate that we don't have a fertile policy context, but that's not the same everywhere. And we shouldn't just think, oh, this is impossible, it's really difficult. There's amazing stuff in England, and we can do this. We can make this difference. Yeah, and there's stuff happening everywhere, and we can showcase then across all of the country where things are actually happening, that horizontal power I was talking about earlier.
Terrific stuff. Thanks so much, Neil. It's a really tough choice of these incredible questions that you're all putting in. Thanks so much for those. I'm going to take one from Rhiannon, who asks, there's been a huge amount of local level activity. How do we harness this to create the critical mass needed to make a difference at national government level? Sarah.
Yeah, well, thanks, Rhiannon, for the question. And I suppose, you know, part of it comes down to power, and also I think it comes down to, you know, looking at what you can do locally and thinking about how you can scale that up. And that's one of the questions we're looking at CLES in terms of the community wealth building movement. How can we deepen it? How can we embed it within areas, and how can we also scale it up so that it isn't it is something that becomes part of a new economic model, rather than just being kind of scattered, if you like, that it becomes like a part of how our institution, our economic model work. It's that kind of paradigm change that Neil was talking about at the start. And I think to do that, it's about kind of rewiring not only our economy, but our politics. Because I think at the minute, for many people, the way in which our politics works, not just in England, but across the UK in many respects, politics can become the inertia. And I think where that's different is locally, where people are actually trying to change things on the ground. And so I think it's something about understanding that the change we want, and the kind of movement for a different type of approach is going to come not from Westminster, but also from the kind of towns, from high streets, from neighbourhoods where people are experiencing the worst effects of the economy firsthand, and where, you know, quite often they're also trying to change it. I think we can't underestimate the importance of that local context, and how that, as we saw in Brexit, can actually you know, really activate people to asking for and demanding a different way. And I think that's something that we as progressives need to start thinking about. You know, how do we start to reactivate at scale and re-energize and re-support people? You know, as you talked about at the start, Rachel, as citizens, to recognise that this is not a them and us in terms of the state, but it's an us and us. We own the state. It's our money. It's our economy, as Neil said, and starting to build confidence from that and come together from different areas across the UK, and setting out a better opportunity for the future. And I think that is sometimes less about trying to influence Westminster and trying to get our message into, you know, the dark corridors of power at Whitehall, and more about setting up our own networks between places and almost bypassing Westminster in the process. And I think, as Neil said, you know, building relationships with other parts of the UK as well. You know, there's brilliant work on community wealth building going on in Scotland, and really, really good work in Northern Ireland too. And, you know, I think trying to break bread with different parts of the country and really starting to build a movement for change, which isn't about influencing Westminster and trying to you know, deal with that kind of broken model, but building a different model of change and activism, which actually speaks to people's real experience of life.
Thanks so much for that, Sarah. Neil, can I put the same question to you?
Yeah, I'll be brief. And a great question, Rhiannon, because you're into tactics. So I love tactics. You know, this is tactics. That's great stuff. And in CLES, we all talk a lot about tactics. I think very quickly, I think there's top down, bottom up here. And I think from the bottom up perspective, there's two things you need to thought about. All of us, you that are activists, you need to collaborate like mad, commune like mad. You know, you really need to get together and work together to create this energy, harness that energy. And then when you do things, you do it, you show it. If it works, you tell people about it. You sing from the rooftops about it, because those things work. I think that's really important. Collaborate mad and persuade by having impact. But at the same time, and this is maybe challenging for traditional community and voluntary sector activity, you need to get political. This is political economy here. You need to see this as a question of climate, economic, racial, social justice. You need to get political. You can't see this as like community activity. It's all quite neutral. We're not that. We're not this. You are to act in the way you do is deeply political, because it's kind of saying we need more power and to do power in different ways. So you're going to have to break out of that and say, no, don't get political. You're going to have to get political, because you're set in that, and how we need to have more political education, more political activism alongside that grassroots activism that's usually sometimes stays away from the politics of things. And finally, I think the third thing is top down. We've got these major anchor institutions in place. It's important to work with them, our NHS, our universities, our colleges, our local authorities. They spend things, they employ people, they have land and property. We need to work with them. They are our trees to us as bees. Yeah, they can give us, they give us sustenance. And so we need to work with coalitions of anchor organizations and progressive in those organizations who want to do good things. And as we at CLES go around the country, I always, and I think we all, CLES is the same, we all do this. It's like, who's the zealous person with energy that wants to try something different? There could be the Vice Chancellor of the University. There could be somebody in the NHS, some manager, some director. There could be somebody involved in the integrated. Somebody there has got a passion who wants to do something differently, and to hook onto them and start to scale up with and alongside them. I think we could talk a long time about tactics, so I'll shut up because I've not got time, but tactics are fascinating. That's the game we're in this change moment we're in. It's all about tactics and all about working the system the way we can.
Great stuff. Thank you so much for that, Neil. We've just got time for a final question. I'm a big fan of all these questions coming up. Also loving the discussion in the chat, both around the questions raised and also the conversation carried out by our two panelists. It's really, really great to see. But this final question is from Ryan, who asks, how can community wealth building support small d democratic decision making, giving local people a voice in shaping their economy beyond those leading anchor institutions? Touches on some things you've already, both of you raised, but if I could just ask you that final question, first of all, Sarah.
Yeah, well, I mean, at the heart of the community wealth building movement is a desire to kind of re-democratize the economy. And I think that comes from a recognition that we're not just dealing with that kind of centralized political power in the UK, but we're also dealing with a sort of centralized economic power base, in that people feel, and I know I'm preaching to the converted here, but what people feel disconnected from the local economy. They and many people are very much at the mercy of their employer and don't have a sense of control over their own kind of economic future. So I guess that's the challenge, and community wealth building tries to re-democratize by rewiring the economy through new models of ownership and new models of engagement. And I think there is a real opportunity for community wealth building to start to think about how we scale that up and how we deepen that democratic engagement, and see that as part of the process. And I think that's one of the real opportunities of community wealth building, which I think we can really start to mobilize in the coming years. And I think the conversation on devolution is part of that, and there's been a lot of talk about devolution as a means to to support greater democracy and localism. But I think the thing that's missing from that discussion at the minute is about the devolution of economic power. How do you enable places to flex their economic muscles differently, in a way that delivers better outcomes for people and actually involves them in the process, and they can actually take charge of. It's not just like a sort of consultation exercise, but they are a willing and an active participant. And I think that for me is really starting to get at true devolution, if you like, one that brings both economic and political power to the table.
Thanks so much for that, Sarah. And Neil? Very,
very quickly, I think it's a good it's a good question, and I think there's lots to say, because there's a lot of work on community wealth building on all this, and I think the aligned movements like the new municipalist movement is very key in this, in terms of harnessing the power of the grassroots activism to scale things up. But across the CLES 5 pillars, there's myriad of examples around workplaces and fair work and workplace democracy, around different forms of community finance, around different types of community ownership, around how do we repurpose spending towards community businesses and social enterprises, and wider questions, I think, of like democratizing the economy. So there is lots of examples there, and it's just about scaling them up, as I say. I would also say that it's important to note that there's more fertile enabling contexts across the UK. So I would say, not just from Scottish, that Scotland does have more of a fertile enabling context through Community Empowerment Act and so forth, in terms of community involvement, than perhaps England does. I think Wales is similarly more in that zone, and even Northern Ireland. And I think having that community power context, and I think again from an broad English lens, there's actually quite a poor context to that sort of enabling environment that takes the small to the less small, to the medium, to the big. And I think there is more pathways in other administrations that are more able to achieve that.
Great stuff. Thank you, Neil. Thank you so much for all those brilliant questions. And again, apologies for not having the chance to go through them all. It just remains for me now to thank the very brilliant Neil McInroy and Sarah Longlands for such a fascinating discussion. You've given us so much to think about and so much to hope about as well. Absolutely terrific stuff. And with that, I'd like to hand back to Tom.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, and thanks so much to yourself for doing such a great job in chairing the event today. Yeah, yourself, Sarah, Neil, the audience, you've all been fantastic. I think you've, yeah, as Rachel was kind of alluding to there, you've really hit home with the challenges that we face, but but also kind of alluding to what we can start to do to turn the dial in spite of these challenges. So we're gonna take what we've heard today and knit that together into our second podcast that's going to be available in the next couple of weeks. Just a final reminder again to check out our Centre of Excellence. It's been refreshed today, new case studies there. There's a new publication that I mentioned. If you're interested in our communities of practice, in health, housing, local government, do get in touch. Just as a final thing, it is Neil's last day today, and we're going to be giving him a proper send-off later on, albeit a COVID-safe one. But it would be remiss of me if I didn't take this opportunity to pay him a brief tribute. There's been a lot of love coming through for Neil in the chat, a lot of love and respect. This is hard. Neil, it's difficult to put into words what you mean to the movement of progressive thinkers, of doers out there, and particularly to the CLES staff team. We really are a family here at CLES, and you've been a fantastic friend, leader and colleague to us all over the years. So on behalf of CLES, from colleagues new and old, thank you from the bottom of our hearts for everything, for all that you've done for CLES, and particularly all that you've done for the community wealth building movement. And finally, just to say, we really look forward to working with you in your new role and continuing the good fight. So thank you so much for everything. Well, that's all, folks. On that poignant note, I'm gonna draw it to a close, and it's goodbye from us. Have a great rest of the day, a great weekend, and we'll see you all soon. Take care. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. Thanks, Tom.